Well, I'm Ivy Nalama Josiah. People know me as Ivy Josiah, the women's rights activist. I'm associated with Women's Aid Organization, which was the first organization in this country that opened a shelter for battered women and their children. So I'm also involved not only in women's rights advocacy, but I'm also involved in the arts. I'm a member of Five Arts Center. Well, I was born in Brickfields, okay, lower middle class family. The walls were very thin in these flats, in these low cost flats, right? And it was a wondrous childhood. I mean, we played Kauda County, we cycled all over the place. I mean, I cannot still cycle, but I tried to. Uh, and it was a very much a neighborhood place, where every evening we would go out and play, and then the mothers will come in around about 5, 6 o'clock and say, everybody get back and wash and have dinner. So it was a very neighborhood place. Everybody knew each other. Like I said, the walls are very thin. So when I was in around about Form 2, Form 3, I heard someone cry. Specifically my neighbor's wife was crying, and she was saying, don't hit me in Tamil, right? And I remember it was like around about 10 o'clock, 10 p.m., 11 p.m. We were all fast asleep. And of course, we turned on the lights immediately and we came out into the living room. And then my mother went into the kitchen. My mother sort of knew what was happening, but for me, it was a shock. So she just started turning on the lights, banging the pots, basically sending a message to the batterer, the husband. We know what's going on, you know? And that was their awakening for me, right? So there was this woman being beaten, and we didn't call the police. We couldn't do anything. I wanted to just walk into the house and tell him to stop, but we didn't do that, right? We just sort of minded our own business because domestic violence was seen as a private affair. But my mom, Amma, did what she tried to do. So I think from that onwards, from that day onwards, from that night onwards, actually, you know, it kind of ignited something in me to say that, oh, we are silent when women get beaten. So I think that was really the start. Like I said, my childhood was wondrous, joyful. My mother is the best amma in the world. She was a fantastic cook. One of my favorite stories, my mother is like, I remember going for Easter service. It's a midnight service, so that means we would come back home about 2 a.m. in the morning, right? I remember during the service, we all line up to get Holy Communion, right? And when they were lining up to get the Holy Communion, there was a girl who was wearing bell bottoms. So I was telling my mother, that's what I want. That's what I want. I hope we can get it one day. Let's go to Globe's store and get it one day. You know what my mom did? We came back home at 2 a.m. in the morning, right? And she took out fabric, sewed me a pair of bell bottoms. So when I woke up at 7 a.m. or 7:30 a.m., there it was, my blue bell bottoms. Very badly sewn because there's a certain skill to sewing bell bottoms. But it's the love and the thought, right? And so I'll always remember mother's love is God's love, unconditional love. My father was a very quiet man, a very, didn't say much, but when he did open his mouth, he was always was full of wisdom. My father, in fact, also instilled a sense of opposition in me, that you must always, fight for people who didn't have a voice. So I remember when I turned 18, he took me to go and register to vote, right? And he said, always vote for the opposition. I mean, during that time, I think it was always a given that the opposition will always be the opposition. I mean, now we know the opposition can also be the ruling government. He was more aware of the politics around him. He was aware of he was involved in church activities. He was like, in church committees. And so my father was kind of like not an activist, but more like involved in what's happening around him, but he joined the committees and so on. Um, of course, my father was the protector because my mother was really very strict with me. I mean, please, y- I was in university and I would be hanging out with my friends, right? And I'll be, and she didn't understand, why do you have to hang out with your friends and come back home at 10 p.m.? We were just hanging out in the mama stall, having tea, coffee. I wasn't even drinking. And I didn't drink until very late. I was so terrified of my parents. And I would come back home and she would lock the door. She would not allow me to come in, right? And then I'll wait outside and my father will come and open the door and let me in. So he kind of like, sort of, soften the blows. So, my mother was a disciplinarian, my father was not. But when I look back, it was both of them played their own roles. Whatever it is, what's most important is that it was unconditional love from both of them. My father was an accounts clerk at the EPF. So we were a modest family. My mother was a full-time housewife. My mother was like the treasurer of the family. She was really in charge of the finances. So this home that you see today was bought by her kutu money and became the deposit, because those days, the housewives will get together and they'll put money into a pot. So my mother was able to get $300 from this pot, and she put the deposit on this house in 1955, the year I was born, because she wanted to make sure that her daughter had dowry. So it was very important for her that her daughter had dowry. Of course, I'm completely against the whole dowry system, but the whole thought was my daughter must have dowry and must be able to hold her head high up when she enters, marriage and goes into another family, right? That's a good question about kindergarten, because nobody ever asks me about my kindergarten. So for kindergarten, I went to a Tamil school, right? So it was Vivekananda school, because my parents were very proud of the Tamil culture. I learned to play the violin, but Carnatic violin. My mother wanted me to learn Tamil, read and write. So for kindergarten, it was a Tamil school. Then the primary school was St. Teresa's Convent. And then later on, we went on to Convent Bukit. So I'm a convent girl through and through. And I must say, going to Convent Bukit, that's where I formed my friendships. Until this day, the friendships remain. Ambika Srinivasan, her sister Swarapini, my friend Kanagam. From, some of them from primary school right up to now, we still remain friends. And it was in Convent Bukit because, I became a prefect. In fact, Ambika was the head girl. I was the vice head girl. They used to tease me, yeah, you're head of all vice, because I was the naughty one. And my Ambika was wise beyond her years, really, even at that age. And we used to talk a lot about the country, about what is happening, because remember it was a time when we all had to do our exams in Bahasa Malaysia, and then we were all brought up. We throughout our lives we were doing, everything was in English, so Bahasa Malaysia became like such a threat to us. We have to pass Bahasa Malaysia. In fact, I kept failing it, and I had to repeat my Form 5 just in order to get a pass or a credit so that I can go on to Form 6. I was determined. I was so determined to go to university. I was very clear. My father was, never mind, Ivy, or they call me Kichan. It's okay, we can get you married, remember, you have a dowry. And then you'll be looked after by the husband. I was so very clear. I wanted to have my own career. It was very simple, my ambition. I remember being in a taxi one day. We were right in the middle of town. It was raining cats and dogs, and we were in a taxi. I looked out and I saw this bus stop, and everybody was, under the bus stop. And I told myself, you know what? I'm going to go to university, earn enough money to be able to own my car, because I don't want to go by bus because of the rain. So my very simple ambition. I just wanted to go to university so I can afford a car. Yeah. So school, Convent Buchanan was an amazing school. The sisters, whether Sister Fergus, Sister Helen, Sister Daniel, they really encouraged us to speak our mind. You know, They encouraged us to have discussions about the world outside, about poverty, about how we should be able to contribute to society, right? And so I think school was a time where, especially secondary school, was a time where, because the nuns were teaching us, they would bring in issues, social issues into the class. And because of that, I think we had a lot of discussions around it. One time in school, I remember this very, very well, because one time Ambika's class, whole science, 5 science 1, they decided to wear the baju kurung, to stand in solidarity with Muslim girls who wore the baju kurung every Friday. This was such a lovely gesture, right? Right? I mean, these days we all wear the baju kurung. So when they wore the baju kurung, somehow the whole thing was misinterpreted. The headmistress at that time, not a nun, headmistress at that time, chided the Form 5 girls to say they shouldn't have worn the baju kurung. This is a Malay costume, not a Malaysian costume, a Malay costume. And I remember thinking to myself, but it's a national costume. Shouldn't it be a national costume, right? And we were really quite, I wasn't part of the 5 science 1, but I was friends with 5 science 1 because Ambika was in 5 science 1, right? So I remember talking about this after this whole incident took place. We were sitting in the canteen, and I remember Ambika saying, we really need to know more about the politics of this country, because surely the baju kurung should be something that all of us can wear. Surely. And I was thinking the sari too, whatever, the chongsam. So all of these ideas were already in our heads. We are Malaysians, right? We are Indian, but we are Malaysians. We're Chinese, but we are Malaysians. We are Melayu, Malay, but we are Malaysians. So we were very idealistic, right? So all of these ideas came from convent Bukit growing up, studying and talking. So when I went to University Malaya, there was no feminist studies. Okay, so I did English literature. And in English literature, there was one lecturer, G.D. Mock, who was trying to introduce female authors and female writers, and the word feminism is all very new to us. The word feminism, the perspective of a women writer. So already I was started thinking about women's rights, women's writing. So again, we come back to my friendship with Ambika. It was Ambika who had come back from England after doing her law. I had graduated from university, still thinking about women and wondering about, even among my friends, we were thinking like, is our destiny to be married? Because my mother was like, okay, now you're at university, that's it. We have to find you a bridegroom and we'll get you married. So at that time, when Ambika returned from England as a lawyer, Women's Aid Organization began. It was the first year, the first few months, and they were looking out for lawyers. Okay, so the Association of Women's Lawyers was invited to come for a meeting, and Ambika said, "Hey, I'm going for this meeting. Why don't you come along?" Because remember, we are convent girls, right? We are convent girls who always want to do something for society. So I said, "Yeah, let's go in." And I've said this many, many times before. Once I walked into the refuge, into the shelter, where there was a big discussion. It was what they call a support group meeting. Volunteers, members, battered women, the residents, all talking at the same time. When I heard the word again, feminism, I heard the word again, patriarchy. And I knew I've arrived home. This made sense to me. Why am I supposed to get married and have a dowry? What is it? I'm supposed to buy a bridegroom? Why was it so important for me to have this dowry? So it kind of answered all the questions I had, that it's my destiny to be a wife, a mother. So Women's Aid Organization kind of like really, opened up my whole world, and kind of also influenced me to be the woman that I am today. Because there were so many ideas floating around. There were so many discussions. We used to have study sessions. We used to look at the Bible. We used to look at Buddhism. I know used to look at religion and what has religion got to say about women? Because, of course, all we heard about religion is how terrible it is when it comes to women, right? So I did a lot of, I sought knowledge and we discussed a lot of important issues during Women's Aid while volunteering, while driving around, picking up women, helping women make police reports. And then, of course, when he started volunteering for Women's Aid in 1982, 83, there was no Domestic Violence Act, right? Women were going to the police station, or rather we would never not even think of making a police report, but we wanted to test it out. And then, the police will say, hey, there's no undang-undang, there's no law. That started Women's Aid organization together with other groups, started a whole advocacy plan, advocacy movement towards getting a law for domestic violence. So I've always wanted to be a teacher. So I was a teacher. I was very, very clear. I really enjoyed my teaching years. I was in a government school, then I was in a private school. I really, really enjoyed teaching. Till this day, my students are still my friends. Okay. After 12 years of teaching, something was stirring me. I couldn't bear to go into class to teach grammar again. I wasn't very happy. And I tried to do other things. I tried to take on another career. I failed. For one whole year, I was in charge of a student scholarship program. No, I wasn't happy there either. But all this while, I'm volunteering, right? I'm volunteering for Women's Aid. And then Tan Seok Chu, who's the daughter of Tun Tan Siew Sin, who is the patron and the founder of Women's Aid organization, turned around. She was a committee member and said, she knew I was struggling with my career, wondering, what am I going to do next? What am I going to do next? She said, why don't you become the first executive director of Women's Aid? Women's Aid is obviously growing. We need an ED. And I was like, what? Be paid to do this work? Because it's always the volunteer spirit, right? To be paid to run Women's Aid organization. And the penny dropped. I said, yeah, why not? And then I became the first executive director of Women's Aid in 1995. But all along before that, I was a volunteer. So I taught in Sekolah Alam Shah, which is a residential school, a government school. I left Sekolah Alam Shah, then I went on to teach in Mara for a couple of years. Then I had a wonderful time teaching in a private school called Prime College. And that was my last teaching post. So, but what I also want to say that, yes, I didn't want to go into a classroom and be in front of a blackboard and teach grammar and all of that. But in my work as executive director, as an activist, as an advocate, you end up teaching, you end up training, you're teaching government servants, you're teaching police, you are re-educating all these institutions to be sensitive to women's issues, right? You're constantly teaching. Every day, you're trying to impart and communicate the message that women are equal, right? And you have to find various ways, and your teaching skills, all the teaching skills I have acquired and I'm still acquiring, became very useful. And I've gone back to teaching now because that's really my first love. I love teaching. I'm now I'm conducting online classes on, guess what? Gender equality and violence against women. So now I do online teaching, right? But my courses are on gender equality and violence against women, and I'm linked with Asia Pacific Center of Education for International Understanding under the auspices of UNESCO. It's a mouthful. It's an institution based in Korea, and they conduct online courses for young people, for educators, for global understanding. Um, so I do this twice a year, and I conduct these classes. And my students are women from not only from Korea, but from Brazil, from India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Kenya, Afghanistan, Iran. And I make it very special. I've insisted that this class be only women because I know that when the class is only women, I'm creating a safe space for the exchange of stories because generally all women have experienced discrimination, have had some form of violation. Not all women, but certainly, okay. Because I know that all women experience discrimination firsthand. So I've created a space, it to be an only women space, Zoom space, because then women speak freely. I used to have a class where there were men. And you know what happened? The women from Iran and Afghanistan will never even turn on the camera because they don't want anyone to know they're going through a gender equality class. There wasn't trust. So then I said, okay, let's make it only women class. And the stories flowed. There was a free exchange of stories because it was a trusting space. Okay, my first year in Women's Aid Organization was all about learning through mistakes, right? Because I was the first executive director. In fact, I was called the executive secretary, and then we changed the name to executive director. It was because I was working at the refuge, I had an opportunity to interact with the women themselves. So the interaction with the women and the children gave me a better understanding of family violence, of domestic violence. So when I joined Women's Aid on a full-time basis, that was 1995. We had already passed the Domestic Violence Act in 1994. But guess what? 1995, we don't know where the act was, got lost. It was passed, but not implemented. So in 1996, we organized a protest. It was the beginning of my life full of protest because I know that if we don't make noise, no one is going to get hurt. Of course, first we start peacefully, we send memorandums, we had a lot of petitions. The passing of the act itself, we had a whole bunch of petitions signed everywhere and all over Malaysia. But when it came to the law itself passed in Parliament, it was sitting somewhere. It was not being implemented. It was not being actually implemented as a law. So in 1996, around International Women's Day, Women's Aid Organization together with AWAM and other groups decided to protest, implement the Domestic Violence Act now. Mind you, this is 1996, right? It was the year where Dr. Mahathir was still the Prime Minister. It was a time where the ISA was used, where people can be disappeared, people can be arrested for protesting against the government. So a motley group of women got together, just about maybe, I would say about 25 women. We were terrified. We were terrified because we kept thinking, what, we were arrested. But of course, we made sure we talked to lawyers and lawyers were on standby. Anyway, we went to a hotel where we knew the minister at that time was giving a speech and we protested outside. We held a banner and we said, implement the Domestic Violence Act now. Nothing happened to us. We came out on the front pages of almost every newspaper. What was also very important is that we had the support from media. Because by then, in 1996, the Straits Times, the Malay Mail, the Star, all of them, including Berita Harian and Utusan, all of them were doing stories about domestic violence. Because we had a really good strategy. So I think one of my biggest achievements has been to work with media, because I always wanted to be a journalist, right? So, this part of me, like going and sitting in front of the editor and say, do stories about domestic violence and about women's rights. So we had the support of the media too. So all of that culminated. I remember one particular article in the Straits Times, "Move it, Minister, move this law." And so the law was passed not passed, sorry, it was passed in 1994, but the law became was implemented, was in action only in 2 years later in 1996. So I think what we learned from this lesson is that don't take anything for granted. Just because you have a law, it doesn't mean that you can taste it, you can use it, you can whatever. You need to make sure the structures of the law, the welfare department, the police department, the courts, all knew how to use the law. Then we learned, guess what? They didn't know how to use the law either. In the beginning, the law was crazy. The law said the processes and the protocols for the Domestic Violence Act in order to get protection. So one of the highlights of the Domestic Violence Act is that you can get immediate protection because we wanted the violence to stop. But in order to get the protection, not the case now, but in 1996, 1997, 1998, woman had to go and make a police report first. Then she had to go to the welfare department to get counseling. The welfare officer had to call in the husband for counseling. Now, we all know that men are not going to turn up. The batterers, not men, batterers will not turn up. So when we found out the protocols were so difficult, then we had to again come up with new protocols and say it's not fair that you're trying to reconcile a couple that's got violence. It can be an option, it can be something they can volunteer to do, but you cannot make it cannot make it a condition that you can only get a protection order kalau if you get counseling. Thank goodness, with all our advocacy, with all our lobbying, and even the welfare officers themselves were saying, we are calling the husbands, no one is turning up. Please, let's get the protection order. So everybody was on board. But the point of my story is this: nothing comes to us easy. Nothing comes to us easy. There's a law in place, there's a constitutional provision in place recognizing gender equality, but still we're not equal in this country. No, I was never under the ISC, but we always, okay. So Operation Lalang, 1987, right? My friends, the 5 women who were detained were friends of mine. Cecilia, Hengling, Irene. And in the 80s was it the time when we lived under the fear of the ISA. You kept thinking anything you do, they can put you under ISA because a whole bunch of activists got jailed, right? Got detained. Not only did they get detained, they were disappeared. You don't even know where they were for the first 30 days, the first 2 weeks. Had no right because the law allowed for you to for the authorities to take you away and interrogate you. It was scary, right? Yeah. It was a very scary time. During that time, in the 80s, right after my friends were detained under the ISA, we are continuing our work, right? We were continuing our work on the Domestic Violence Act. Seems like a harmless activity. How can it be a threat to the nation, to the security of the nation? So we were organizing exhibitions in the Central Market, promoting how the law should be passed. One day, the Central Market people, the ones who allowed us the space, called me in to say that they had a visit by Special Branch. Special Branch officers came to the office at Central Market. Who is this Ivy Josiah? Who are the organizers of this Domestic Violence Act exhibition? And I'm like, even organizing a domestic violence public education event is a threat to the nation, it's a threat to security. I was so angry. Anger is good. Anger gives you courage. And I remember after that, when I used to go, during the time, I remember one of the ISC detainees was brought to court. I remember going to give him support in court, and I saw Special Branch taking photographs of us. I mean, we know it's Special Branch because they have very nice. You know how it is. You know they're Special Branch because their shoes are very well polished. They might be wearing ordinary clothes, but somehow the discipline of policemen, right? They have polished shoes. So I used to go up and say, "Why are you taking our photographs?" I used to just ask them questions like that. I used to just ask questions like that. I didn't want to show that I was afraid. Of course, I was terrified. But courage is not about being fearless. Courage is about controlling your fear and going forward, right? So I think 1987 Operation Lalang made me even more political, and especially special branch asking questions about who's organizing this domestic violence campaign. I mean, please. So obviously, one of the first challenges of WAO was that we are bringing in women, we're giving them shelter, but there's no law, and that's why lobbying for the implementation of the Domestic Violence Act was very important. So therefore, the first protest, right, in 1996. Then later on, I think the other okay, hang on. Then the other challenges were, you know, women and what kind of opportunities do they have if they were to be separated from their husbands? Do they have job opportunities? Do they have cheap housing? Because remember, women flee with their children, right? And it was very difficult for women to find cheap housing. It was very difficult for women to go to work, and who's going to look after their children, right? And so that led us to lobby, but we've not been very successful, that really we need to have preferential housing. We need to have special housing for women who are in crisis. We have not been very successful with that. So what we did was we started our own childcare center. So we had the refuge, and then we started our childcare center. And again, Ambika was involved in the beginning. We were going around figuring out how the childcare center should be set up, but it was primarily for women who've decided to go back to work, or first of all decided to leave their violent husbands, go to work, but then didn't have any childcare support. So they could leave the children in the childcare center for up to 2 years. So that allowing them, you know, for a breather, for them to be able to go to work. They stayed outside, and every weekend they must come back and spend time with their children. So, but we were experimenting with this. We hope that the government will set up these childcare centers all over Malaysia so that there's a place for single mothers, especially single mothers from leaving violent relationships. Because you also needed to be in a space that was safe, because husbands will come looking for you, right? So the childcare center was well protected, and we had cameras and all of, we were very sure that we made sure it was a secure space. So that was a challenge. What all the needs of single mothers. In fact, we came up with research around what the government should do for single mothers. The other challenge was funding, always, right? Because we are growing. We wanted more social workers. We wanted more advocacy officers, because obviously, besides the social work part of it, the welfare, so-called welfare, or I prefer to say social work part of it, we needed to change the law. We needed to advocate for the changes in law, because it's not just the Domestic Violence Act, it's the Guardianship Act. It's a whole bunch of laws that needed to be changed, starting with the Constitution. So we wanted to hire more researchers, hire more advocacy officers. So when I took over, or not took over, sorry. So when I became the executive director, I was very clear that advocacy must be a very important component of Women's Aid Organization, that we need to work with other groups, other women's groups, not only just women's groups, but also work with any human rights group, that we shouldn't just only be focused on women's rights, but we should also be focused on civil and political rights, that we should also be talking about election reform. So that was another big area of work that I did, was working together with BERSI. Women's Aid Organization played a very important role in the advocacy for free and fair elections. So raising money for people to do the work was an important challenge. But I think, yes, it was a challenge, but it was not insurmountable. We could raise the money. You know, I hated filling up forms. So, when you want to get money from foreign governments and from foundations. Oh my God, you got to fill up a whole bunch of forms. I really didn't like it. But I found out that if you told us the story of the lives of women, if you shared the vision of Women's Aid Organization of how they want it, how our vision and how the women's movement's vision is about gender equality, a lot of people donated, individuals, corporations, they just gave us money. So we received quite a lot of money from complete strangers, from corporations, without having to fill up many forms, except give them a report. So we were quite successful in raising money. So besides, the advocacy and the implementation of laws and the challenges that domestic violence survivors faced, always funding is a big challenge. In fact, just this year, I've gone back to Women's Aid as a volunteer to raise money for the organization because funding is a challenge. When I say funding was very easy, it's because I had a really good network and I used my network. So the arts network, starting with Five Arts Center. So they would have, I remember organizing a art exhibition with the Five Arts Center. And then we got artists to donate paintings and we sold the paintings and a donation went to Five Arts. We also approached other theater companies where they would do a play, they would do a performance, and a part of the proceeds will come to Women's Aid. Again, it's to do with my network. Again, it has to do with my network, my very wide network, very colorful network, I would say, because I was very much involved in the arts. And then media, of course. So I started, coming up with inventive ideas, work with women's magazines, right? Create stories with women's magazines. Put a story in Marie Claire, put a story in Her World, and always have a little box to say, we're looking for money. I was able to persuade the Star, to have 16 days of activism every day starting November 25th till December 10th. Different parts of the Star, from the sports section to the music section to the editorial, ran a story about violence against women, right? I started working with corporates. I think one of my most successful relationships, or rather Women's Aid organizations relationship, is with the Body Shop. Without fail, every year, Hari Wanita, August 25th, we would, besides having an event, would also raise money by selling a product, a Body Shop product. So like that, we started working with companies that had products, golf tournaments. I mean, you couldn't keep me quiet. Anywhere I went, and I had a pretty active social life, anywhere I went, I think I was a bit of a nuisance sometimes. Invariably, I would end up talking about Women's Aid. And I wasn't shy of the press. I was known as Dialer Quote Ivy Josiah. If the journalist called me and asked me for a quote, I would give it a quote. If I didn't know about the topic, I will help the journalist get someone to give the journalist a quote. So we started working. Women's Aid Organization was one of the first NGOs or first women's organizations that reached out to radio. So we reached out to Tamil radio, Chinese radio, English radio, and started creating stories. We started creating plays, radio plays, and then, to talk about domestic violence. The Tamil radio, we actually reenacted in Tamil a situation, a drama minggu ini kind of thing, And then I remember those days when we came on radio. There would be like 25 to 30 phone calls that day at WAO. We'll make sure we have stationed that we had about 6 lines, right? So we make sure there were at least all 6 lines were somebody, a social worker was at the other end of the line. So it was quite fun. Remember my passion for media, right? Because actually, secretly, deep down below my belly, I want to be a journalist. I want to be a media person. So I was very excited to work with, radio, television, newspapers. When I retired, when I turned 60, I retired, right? So called retired. But I was restless, of course. I was going to sit at home and, and rest. Oh, no, there was still so much to be done. So one of my first projects after I retired was to work with says.com, Nandini Balakrishnan. I wanted to work with a woman who I was so fascinated with. She spoke so well. She was funny and witty and sharp, right? And so I went to her and said, would you like to do something around domestic violence? Because when you talk about domestic violence, what to look out for, what are the warning signs of domestic violence? What do you do when there's child abuse? But because when you speak, your audience is a different audience altogether. So can we use your voice? So she did that. She did 6 episodes. I think one of my proudest moments were that Bersay was led by women, by Maria Chin Abdullah and Ambika Srinivasan. And her, the people around her were also women. Of course, there were many men too. But Women's Aid Organization was very involved in Bersay. I mean, aside from organizing people to go down to the protest, we were in the organizing committees. Invariably, I would have been in charge of the performances because of my white network with the artists and performances and performers rather. And I think Bersay for me is truly what I would love the women's movement to be. That is truly a movement. A movement is something where you don't have to say, okay, let's try and get 1,000 people together. Spontaneously, the citizens, the people on the ground organize themselves. And that's what we saw in Bersay, right? It was a Malaysian movement. And courage, right? So when we go down to the streets, we were told, if you go down to the streets, we're going to arrest you. If you wear a yellow t-shirt, we're going to arrest you. And yet people turned up in yellow t-shirts. I cannot, I, I'm, s- I'm really, I'm in admiration of Malaysians, right? And let's not forget, before Bersay, there was Hindra. There were Indians who were organizing themselves, going down to the streets to say, violations are happening to us. We are being discriminated. So I really get inspired by people's movements. Now, with the women's movement, I think we are very Klang Valley centered, right? I mean, when we have every year, when we have the International Women's Day, remember International Women's Day in 1996, we had only about 30 people who went there to protest and say, implement Domestic Violence Act now. Okay, now we have about 1,000 women, but it's not 30,000, it's not 40,000. I hope during my lifetime, I very much doubt it. I want the women's movement where hundreds and hundreds and thousands of women would take to the streets to protest because because the government of the day is depriving us of our rights. For example, this citizenship issue, right? I mean, till this day, we are struggling to recognize Malaysian mothers who are married to foreigners cannot ensure the citizenship of their children. But a Malaysian father, he can get married to anybody he wants, have his wife give birth anywhere he wants. But we expect Malaysian mothers who's married to a German or an Austrian or a Pakistani or Bangladesh, please come back home and have the baby here. Only then can your child be. It is so freaking unfair. This goes against Article 8 of gender equality. What is the use of having having a guarantee in the Constitution, but you're not making it, real on, we're not making it equal for Malaysian mothers. And for me, this is misogyny, mistrust of women. Or if you marry a foreigner, go to your foreign countries. As if somehow we're betraying it. I've been with mothers to immigration where an immigration officer will say, Yalla, what do? You go and marry a foreigner? How insensitive, rude, and plain kurang ajar. Sexist is actually misogyny. So we at Women's Aid, and we when I was Women's Aid has been talking about this issue of national of equal citizenship rights for mothers to be able to confer citizenship to the mother to their children for many years. And we really thought with this government, with this reformasi government, okay, which I'm very much a part of, meaning I was responsible and very involved in bringing about reformasi, which I do not regret at all. Can you imagine that even this reformasi government is putting in all kinds of amendments that are so misogynistic? So I'm very angry. I'm really very angry and disappointed. And I really hope that that this year, and I really do hope that if they do not pass these amendments, I hope women will just take to the streets. Or better still, women will hold back the vote. I think the only way we can teach a lesson to this government is not to vote for them. I know it's easier said than done when you say don't hold back your vote, because the alternative is scary too, right? Yeah, I know that. I do know that. But I think we need to show the power of women. We need to show the anger of women. It's righteous anger for me. For me, it's all righteous anger. I'm really grateful for all the awards, right? I mean, I got an award from the Agong. I got many awards from many corporates, um, Rotary Club, Leo Club, and all of that. I'm very grateful because for me, the awards is not about me. It's really about the movement and then about Women's Aid Organization. It's about the team. You know, I've always known that everything I've done and achieved, and also some failures along the way, has it was because of the team, because of the women, and most of all, the women who were brave enough to come forward to say, "I'm being victimized. Help me. I want to work with you." Because they allowed us to use their story. They gave us permission to use their stories. And I don't take this lightly at all, because when women come and say, you know, when women give you permission to do it, I use that very respectfully. But you know what's my favorite moment besides the awards and all of that? I'll tell you what my favorite moment. One of my favorite moments, and the awards are important and all of that, but for me, I feel most cherished, most acknowledged when I'm walking around, busy shopping. I remember once I was coming down the escalator and a young man was coming up the escalator and he said, "Auntie Ivy." I'm going like, "Hi, Auntie Ivy, don't remember me?" She said, "I'm sorry, darling, I don't." I said, "What is this? It can't be a teacher. Can't be a student, because he would call me Miss Ivy, not Auntie Ivy, right?" So he comes up and follows me down and he says, "Auntie Ivy, I was at the shelter. Remember, you were at the childcare center. You used to play with me." And I'm going, "Oh my God." Well, it all came back, right? So when the children of the women we have helped, when they recognize me and they hug me, that's for me that's very important. That's when I feel, "Allah, not bad lah. I've done something good here." You know what I mean? Yeah. So that's when I feel most acknowledged. All our efforts, it's always is our. I never say my. I never say my organization. I've always used the word very deliberately so, because it's really got to do with the team, with the women themselves. It's our efforts with the movement, and some occasionally the government. Okay, let me see. I mean, like sometimes, okay, I don't know whether this is a failure. It isn't a failure. For example, getting money from an oil company and then finding out that we shouldn't have taken the money from the oil company. That's a failure, right? Realizing that we need to have a better due diligence when it comes to people giving you money. No, there is a failure, of course. When WA went broke under my care, that's a failure. When I didn't realize that we had no money. I mean, not broke, but we only had about only 6 months of money left, 1 year of money left. When you're so busy advocating, you forgot to fundraise. Or I mean, the failures in my life has been that 1 year when I made a wrong career move, right? The failures in my life has been when I neglected fundraising, when I suddenly realized, and thank God I had a really good executive committee that alerted me, "Ivy, we only have got about 6 months of money left." And I go, "What?" And all my staff, all my colleagues the staff had to take a 10% pay cut. Oh my goodness, I felt I failed my colleagues. I was so ashamed. I had to say, I'm so sorry I've let you down, but the team was amazing. We all took a pay cut, but we were able to raise money within a few months because, again, the branding, the goodwill, and the solidarity was out there, right? And so, yes, I have neglected my work occasionally. I have, for instance, this being broke, almost broke. When you get a 10% salary cut, it does affect your whole livelihood, right? So that's a failure that I have lived with, that I acknowledge, and that is why I'm back at WAO, ensuring that nobody gets a pay cut. Of course, we had to lose a lot of people. A lot of staff had to resign because we didn't have enough money. But we want to make sure there's enough money to be able to hire core staff. So I was always interested in the arts, right? Because my parents obviously, got me to do Carnatic music, but I wanted to dance. And my mother said, no, no decent girl can dance on stage. Who would marry you? Can't go on stage. But I really wanted to dance. So when I joined the university, there was a dance group called Kasuma. You could just volunteer. And guess what? When I went for those classes, I was chosen to be a University Malaya Kasuma dancer. And I started traveling with the group to, to France, to Sabah, Sarawak, and all of that. And even Kasuma was a political issue, right? When I joined Kasuma at that time, well, there were 12 girls and 12 boys. So I remember being chosen, and I went to East Malaysia. And there was an Indian girl who was senior to me, and so there were two Indian girls in the troupe of 12 female dancers. And I remember someone telling me, oh, you have a very good chance of staying on in this troupe because the Indian girl is graduating, so you will take her place. And I went, oh, there could only be one Indian girl and one Chinese. You know what I did? I went back when semester opened, when the term opened, and I got all my friends to say, we all are going to audition for Kasuma. We need to make sure there are more Indians and Chinese joining Kasuma. And as a result of that, we had 6 Malay girls and 6 non-Malay girls, or rather 6 other races. So, my politics even began at University of Malaya, this whole thing about obsession about Malaysian identity. So that's one of the reasons why I was very attracted to Five Arts Centre, because Five Arts Centre, it's all about homegrown performances by Malaysians, scripts by Malaysians, dances choreographed by Malaysians. It was Malaysian, our identity, which is, of course, our identity is just we're not just Tamil or Indian. We are a little bit European. We are a little bit Western. We are very American in our culture. So I really liked Five Arts because it was I really liked Five Arts because it's focusing on the Malaysian identity. So with Five Arts, I began, of course, dancing. Right? I danced Marian de Cruz dances. I learned, Malay dance. I learned modern dance, Martha Graham. I wasn't very good at modern. I was really, really good when it comes to traditional dance. And Marian would come up with movements, and we would do it all together that were different. There would be an infusion of our Indian, Chinese, Western, American influence, right? So when I became a full-time when I became a full-time staff, when I became the full-time staff of the Women's Aid Organization, I didn't have time for rehearsals anymore. I just couldn't. In fact, I had to choose because I would be working till 6, 7, 8 p.m., 9 p.m. at the shelter, and I couldn't go for rehearsals. So that was another decision that if I had to look back, I made a wrong decision there. I should have continued with dancing. Because that was it's good for health, right? I mean, exercise and my creativity. Nevertheless, I chose to give it all to women's aid, and I couldn't go for rehearsals. So then I took on another role. I not rehearsing, not performing, but doing production work. So that's what I do now. I do production work for Five Arts Center. I claim to be a feminist. I identify as a feminist. And there's such a resistance to feminism, because I think there is this myth about feminism that we are man haters. No, we do not hate men, but we do dislike men who discriminate. We dislike people who discriminate. We do not like governments who discriminate. We do not like institutions that discriminate. And of course, that's made up of, men too. And therefore, it's very easy to say, oh, yeah, you're man haters. And you do not want to acknowledge that men can be good. No, we know that men can be good. But the reality is the statistics are very real. 1 out of 3 women face some form of violence in their life. 1 out of 3. The statistics show that men do face violence, but it's a lower statistic for men. So I'm not saying men do not face violence. Young boys face violence. So I'm choosing to put my resources, because I feel very close to women, right? So I would encourage young people, first of all, anyone and everyone. And I think these days, boys and girls, males and females, can join the women's movement. They all can be feminist. For me, you can be part of the movement. For me, you can be part of the movement by, first of all, examining your own life. Where is it that you can stand up and say no to sexism? Stand up and speak up when somebody's making a stupid joke about women. Yep. And mind you, there's too many stupid jokes about women, right? So say, hey, it's not cool. Really? That's really sexist. Yep. Start in your own life, in your own home, in your office where there's sexual harassment. When there's sexual harassment, don't say, oh, it's a joke. Come on, relax. Men are like this. No, men can be better. Yep. Right? And I think this is where you can be part of the movement. You stand up. And I think more and more people are saying that. Yep. Certainly they're saying that. And you can also support women's rights by joining a women's organization, by becoming a member, by funding. You can fund families, you can fund single mothers. Give money. Because all of these causes, whether it's climate change, whether it's women's rights, whether it's poverty eradication, they all are important. And there's a gendered component to all of this. Women are affected differently. So give money, give your funds. But most of all, examine your own life, your own little circle, your own immediate circle, and see where you can stand up and say, that's misogyny, that's hateful, that's not on. I think to be involved in advocacy, invariably you have to be involved with an organization. Because advocacy involves writing memorandums, writing petitions, going to parliament, lobbying parliamentarians, talking to media. So you have to belong to a group that is organized. So if you want to get involved in advocacy, join an organization. If you do not want to become a member, look out for announcements. Get onto the Instagram and Facebook and TikTok of all these different organizations. Besides joining an organization and becoming a member and part of the organizing committee, besides that, just get onto the social media platforms of the different organizations, of any NGOs, especially women's groups. Whether it's, Facebook, shows my age, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and so on. They're always making announcements that they're having a talk, or they're having a fundraiser, or they're protesting, right? Join the protest. So there are ways of being involved in advocacy. There could be a petition. There are always put your name, your signature to a petition. So you may not be You may not want to be involved in a everyday manner. Okay, sorry, hang on. Okay. You may not want to be hugely involved, but you can lend your name to start with petitions and get other people to sign the petitions, right? So there are varying degrees of involvement when it comes to advocacy. But most of all, don't be quiet, right? Just don't be quiet. Use your voice. So during my so-called retirement years, I also decided I want to mount a women's tribunal. So again, of course, I can't do it alone. I sent a text, a WhatsApp message to say, hey guys, how about having a women's tribunal? Because it was during COVID years, everything was online. Let's have an online women's tribunal. Let's get the stories of women out there. And let's get judges at the tribunal, so that they can come up with very clear law reform recommendations. So again, go to the women's group. And everybody was so enthusiastic. And we formed a committee, and it took almost a year to organize it. And now we have this amazing Women's Tribunal website with stories, with live stories, with real life stories and narratives of grassroots women who talk about their discrimination. And that is a website that anybody can go to. In case you're wondering that there's no discrimination in this country, please just go to the website. Now, someone told me this a long time ago. As you grow older and older, you know, you're not going to think about how did I spend enough time in the office. You're not going to think about whether or not, did I spend enough time in Parliament persuading, a minister and a member of Parliament. As you grow older, you will start thinking about what is immediately in front of you, and that's family and friends, right? And friends will become family. Because so much of my life was about community, about fighting for women's rights, and I still do so. I would want people to remember me that I was an effective advocate. I was an inclusive person, that I didn't want to leave anybody left behind. But I also want my family and friends to know that I love them, that I enjoy cooking for them. I love cooking. I love entertaining. That they had the best parties and best dinner parties, around my kitchen table. I want them to remember that part of me, that I loved having a good time. I love laughing. And so, yeah, I would want people to remember me by that I was a good friend too, that I was a good sister, that I was a good daughter.